Okay. Since there really didn't seem to be any interest in having a sort of Zoom session with everyone, I'm just going to sort of present what my thoughts are on the project, and just take them for what they're worth, because I've sort of thought this through, and I still see this. I see this particular location, this particular scenario as being really interesting. Not only do I consider it to be highly possible, especially given the fact that ASB has just changed hands about 3 months ago. And right now, the banking industry with Trump and everything else is going through enormous turmoil, anyways. Um, but also, to be honest, when you look at this particular branch, in this image that we've got here, it's really hard to sort of figure what ASB was thinking. There's a bunch of other branches nearby. And these branches were all built in the 70s and 80s, even into the 90s, with the idea of basically commuter transport. When this branch went in, Kaka'ako was light industrial, and you had the Ward warehouse and Ward complex of shops down Mackay, but you didn't have the high rises, with the exception of maybe one, in this immediate vicinity. And you really didn't have much in the way of shopping development outside of Ala Moana Center. So this was a commuter branch. It was to handle. I would bet a large proportion of their business was probably small business transactions from the various small businesses in the area right around there, because this area was famous for, it still is, body shops, auto work, all sorts of stuff like that. So why, it was easy to see why they put a branch there when they did. It's really hard for me to understand why, in the last 2 years, they've sunk what seems to be a large sum of money into renovating. I mean, they did a nice job. I mean, the thing looks absolutely brand new. But I do see it as sort of a puzzle as to what the thought process was behind, geez, we should renovate this. Um, who knows? I mean, I'm not privy to their logic. So, anyways, the basic assumption we've got is new management has come in. They've gone over their books, which, of course, stereotype of a bank would be something they do, and they see this as a losing proposition. It's now high-rise developments. People do an enormous amount of their business online. ASB, like all the other banks, encourages its folks to go online. They don't. There's very little when you look at the way banks present themselves in 2025 that indicates they really want you to go into a branch. They really want you to do all your services online, terrifyingly enough through your phone, given the low security. But nonetheless, if you've got that logic, then you should sink your cost into IT and upgraded, website design, et cetera, et cetera. Sinking it into rebuilding, you know, outlets, it really doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Anyways, so that's the premise. The new guys have come in. They want to get rid of this thing. Now you can get rid of things two ways. Obviously, one way is to sell it, and a more creative way is to figure out sort of a reuse. And we're just going to assume that whatever reasons, given the fact we're going to assume that ASB only owns that particular location. They don't own the area around there. I don't know. I don't know who the landowner is, but we're going to assume they own that. Having said that, that's not large enough to put a high rise up. So I would suspect if you tried to sell that piece of property right now in 2025, you'd have a really hard time. Retail is almost dead in Honolulu, especially in this part of town. And I don't know what you'd put in there. Fast food, you've got a Jack in the Box up about a block, which is doing terribly. All the other normal conveniences, 7-Elevens or gas stations. There's a gas station right across the corner. What are you going to put in there that's going to be, or what can you propose to put in it that someone's going to actually buy the land and you're going to make some money off of it? And they basically come to the conclusion it's not going to work. So what they've decided to do, and I think it's rather clever, is they've decided to take a tax loss. They're going to write this off the books. This is a time-honored thing that banks love to do for a bunch of stuff, and we're just going to assume in this case they've decided this is a real quick, clean, and easy way to get this sucker, off the books, cut their losses, and they get to take a tax break in the coming fiscal year, which is good because these are new owners coming in. They got to make the books look good. So, in that context, what they've decided to do is they're going to donate the branch. They're going to donate this building and the little parking lot you see around it to whatever not-for-profit organization can make a compelling argument that they can actually effectively use this property. Last thing ASB wants to do is give this to someone who's going to then trash it or have it not work, and all of a sudden the things got cardboard over the front, and it turned out to be a gas disaster because that's going to fall back on them. They need this to look elegant. They need this to look stylish. They need this to look like they knew what they were doing. When you might argue the reality is they just want to get out from under. So whatever. Now, what they're going to do to sweeten the pie and make sure they get what they want out of it, which is an attractive sort of reuse, is they're going to actually give the property up. Now, they've just finished a renovation, so this sucker is basically, for all intents and purposes, new. I don't know what they did on the inside. I've never actually been in the branch, but we're going to assume they've redone the inside. But banks being banks, I'm pretty sure that that's pretty much fluid or flexible space and can be redesigned by you, to whatever format you like. What they don't want you to do is they don't want you to change the outside. This has a very, very unique look. I have a really sneaking suspicion this might be the same architectural firm that did the state capitol. There's a lot of similarities in the way this sucker's laid out. But for whatever, it's definitely unique. It's definitely different. And especially when you look around it right now, there's absolutely nothing that looks like it. There's stuff that looks more modern, but there's not anything that looks like this. And so they want people to remember that it's a bank that started in Honolulu, and they see Honolulu as being their root, their core, and so that they want people to remember they might not be in Kaka'ako anymore as a branch, but American Savings Bank is still part of Honolulu and part of Kaka'ako. And so by giving this building up to a best deserving, best reuse client, they're basically reiterating their commitment to the success not only of Honolulu, but more specifically to Kaka'ako. So that's their logic. You've got to always remember that when you're doing a proposal, in the forefront of your mind and constantly being reiterated is, what does the client want? Not only maybe what they specifically said they want, but also when you actually look into or peel it back, what is it they actually want? You've got to constantly reiterate that, because in this case, they're giving you, if you win the bid, they're giving you basically a brand new building, a piece of property, and some of the prime real estate in the Hawaiian Islands for free. And they'll front the cost for internal renovations if you want to make them. I mean, it's a dream come true for any design firm here in Hawaii. It's also very much a make it break. If you screw this sucker up, you better look for another line of work. So that's the context. You never, never, never want to write a proposal with what you think should be done, and forget to constantly go back to what the client wants. The client's writing you the check. The client's paying the bills. The client's going to be the one that's going to give you a rep online after you're done, or trash you. So you never want to get into the, I'm the specialist. I know what you're doing. I know what I'm doing better than you do. That might be true, but you sure as hell don't want to actually say that. And you never know, especially nowadays with the access of online training and all sorts of other stuff. Who knows, American Savings Bank might have on staff who actually has a background in interior design and urban design. And so they might be able to have someone that's going to actually be able to critique either them, or obviously, I would say very likely, someone in the network of people they know, Hawaii being Hawaii. They obviously do work with other design firms on stuff. There was a design firm that obviously did the work on this branch. So, they know folks, and any bid, any proposal that comes in, they're going to be able to ask folks, hey, here's what these folks are, presenting. Do you think this is going to work? So you're not able to operate in a vacuum. You want to quickly disabuse yourself of the fact that you're a specialist and you know more. Our line of business is basically environmental analysis in one way, shape, or form. Originally, it was cultural impacts, environmental impacts, historical, archaeological impacts. It's now got a lot of the work we do is trend analysis. But it always has to be carried within the context that the client is asking you for something. The client honors you by saying that they trust your expertise more than their own, which is why they're asking you to do it. They're going to pay you for it. But by the same token, they're assuming that you're going to at least honor the fact that they're paying the bills. You're going to do the best that you can for them. And you're always going to make it very clear to them that you're not going to be talking down to them. You're not going to treat them as if you're somebody special. This, to be honest, was a problem with design, especially interior designers back in the 70s and 80s. I used to see a lot of this. My wife did a lot of flipping of places, and also she was an interior designer. And there was a lot of folks that were working in places like she did, like in Kahala and such like that, who would basically burn bridges by coming in as if they were the, you know, design specialist that had this huge amount of sophisticated knowledge of something. And they expected the client to basically give them a check, and they would just sort of redesign the house or the property. And the client was supposed to go, wow, that's so sophisticated. It's so perfect. It's exactly what I wanted. And they would just sort of then walk away, and it was like, well, I'm a specialist. I'm sophisticated. I'm stylish. I know my aesthetics, and I'm going to give you this. And that's, that might have, I'm not sure that ever did work. I can think of 3 designers that don't work here in Hawaii anymore because that's what they used to do. But nonetheless, that's sort of the attitude that they had back at the time, especially with the internet and especially online and things like Home Garden TV and all that. Whatever mystique that interior design had is gone. Whatever mystique that interior designers had, that they had a specialized coterie of knowledge of sophistication about whether it be European or Asian or whatever design that was unique to them, is no longer there. They undoubtedly probably do have unique knowledge, but I can guarantee there's no client that really thinks that. So you have to remember that it's a very different world that we function in now. What they're expecting from you is your ability to synthesize, keep on one hand the client's needs, and come up with creative, adaptive, and unique solutions. And in this particular situation, that has 2 main purposes. One is American Savings wants something really creative and unique to sort of make this a poster child, if you would, for commitment to kaka'ako. So they really want this to work. And they can just take it as a tax write-off, just bulldoze the property and then just write it off. But they're not. They're actually putting a huge amount of risk in terms of money and resources to make something happen. So they're in their own way. They're really committed to this. And if they hire you, they expect something from you that reflects that same level of sophistication, analysis, and looking at all potential possibilities, and then picking the best one. You then, of course, in the proposal, you're doing 2 things. One is you're telling the client what you think will work, but you have to remember a second thing you're doing, especially in this case, because you don't know them and they don't know you, is you're trying to sell your company's ability to do the job better than anyone else. You're out there trying to get a gig. This is just like performance. You're trying to be the best performer out there. And your proposal has that as its other mindset. So it's trying to do 2 not necessarily just totally different things, but 2 distinctively unique things simultaneously. Answer very specifically what it is the client wants in a way that the client's going to both be able to absorb, but also in a way that the client's going to make the client very aware of the fact that you have an enormous amount of insight, analysis, data accessibility, and just creativity. That's going to give you a unique look at this, which is going to give them a unique experience. And that's what proposals are. Proposals are always a combination of telling the client what the client needs based on what the client asked for. But secondly, is also selling your expertise to be the best suited to do that. If you do the best job of selling the client on it, but you don't look the best suited, then someone else is going to get the job. This has happened to us tons of times. And you might have the best proposal and the most creative. But I know of at least 3 cases where we had by far the best proposal. And the client went and took our proposal, and even though this is illegal, went and gave it to other folks who had also submitted a proposal and said, here, we liked yours, but we like this proposal better. Can you do it? And they did. We lost out. But that's part of the learning process. It also tells you what clients you probably don't want to work with. If they're going to do that to you, then they're going to stiff you down the road for something else. Anywho, so you've got to remember that your proposal does 2 things. Secondly, and I think I mentioned this, I did mention this in the older presentation, you have to remember that clients aren't going to read your stuff. It's a constant source of frustration, but the enormous amount of time and effort you spend to do a proposal, and what you'll find is clients, in most cases, well, in fact, in all cases I can think of, that clients, the key clients, in other words, actual decision makers, will look at the page one or two, they'll flip back to the conclusion summary, read that, and then they'll give it to someone who works for them and say, here, read the rest of this. They won't usually say that to you, but well, here, we're going to give it to staff so we can get a full review. So the way they normally put it. And then they're going to make their decision largely based on their first impressions, or I should say maybe their first and last impressions. So you have to remember that when you're writing a proposal, that's why I gave you guys the outline. You have to be very careful. Proposals have to be very, very, very thought out. They have to flow freely. They can't be jumping around. So I assume you're going to have various members of the group write various parts. Well, you got to remember someone's got to be responsible for tying them together. If it hops around, the client's going to drop you. Because clients figure if you can't express yourself in a written proposal clearly and succinctly, then what the hell's going to happen when you're actually in meetings and you're trying to get something done? So this is part of that presenting yourself. Secondly is, since they're only going to look at the first part and the last parts, you have to make sure that both in the very beginning and at the very end, you basically repeat back to them what it is they wanted. What do they want for this property? And so, the simplest way to write a proposal is, what do you want? Here's what you've got. Here's what we think you should do with it. Here's why we're right. And then reiterate back at the very end, here's what you wanted, here's what we're trying to give you. That's a real short and succinct way for all the hard work that you put into a proposal. That's sort of what it boils down to. In this particular situation, especially given this scenario, you do not do a costing. Those are something when you get into your professional careers, if you're not already, you're going to find costings are a major part of what you do. Having said that, costings can never drive the proposal. Costings have to be part of the proposal, but you do a proposal first and then the costing. If the costing says you can't do X or Y, then you redesign part of the proposal, but you never let a proposal be driven by the cost. That's going to be a good way to give it to a competitor. So our project, I would say there's several really key factors you want to keep in mind. One is the stunning demographics for Kaka. In this particular view we have here, I can think of 6 high-rises that right now are under construction. You cannot see them because they're still in the foundation level. But basically by 2 years from now, by this time of year, 2027, about 60% of that skyline you see behind you is going to be high-rises like the ones in front. It's going to be very, very familiar with Hong Kong. It's going to look pretty much like Mong Kok or Jordan District in Kowloon. So it's this whole area is going to be high-rises. Having said that, no one can figure out a way to keep retail ground level frontage open. The amount of empty spaces at the ground level in all these places, because all these places, in part because of Honolulu zoning, are supposed to have ground level retail space. And in many cases, I suspect you could probably go in with $5 and say, here, I'll pay you $5 to take this for a month. And they'd probably just take it and go, fine. A lot of these places that I can see have been open for at least a year. I've lived down here now for 8-9 months. And I have not seen a single new place open in basically an empty storefront. And I've seen at least 6 or 7 places that were functional when I got there that have closed in the last 6 or 7 months. So what to do at ground level is something that everyone's struggling with. And of course, that's your problem because you are at ground level and you're not in a high rise. You've got very limited parking, I think 15 stalls or something like that. So there's no way you're going to have a huge amount of traffic driving up here. The traditional logic would be turned into a restaurant. But if you're familiar with the number of restaurants that have gone belly up in the last year, I wish you a lot of luck on that. So options, the demographics have changed. Let me back up a little bit. Not only have the demographics changed, but if you go back to the earlier presentations I did in Kaka'ako, it originally was argued that Kaka'ako was going to turn into a set of vertical local villages. So if you want to think of that high rise right behind the ASB branch, that could be Kapahulu. The one behind it could be Palolo. So in a weird way, they were sort of seeing these high rises as reiterating or sort of replacing traditional neighborhoods, but doing it vertically rather than horizontally. So if you want to think, you can either have this vertical high rise or you can have Kapolei. And so the argument is that if you're going to be in the city, you got to have vertical high rises. So the argument that was made to the state, and especially the city and county, was that these vertical high rises were going to be new neighborhoods. They just happen to be stacked versus laid out flat. And especially in the early stages, I'd say till say 15 years ago, this actually turned out to be much more the case than I think, to be honest, the developers actually thought. And that's because the developers were operating off what I call sort of a 1990s mentality, which is when you built high rises, you built them entirely for, foreign occupation, if you would, mainland and or Asia. Trump Tower is a perfect case in point. The Ritz-Carlton down in Waikiki is a perfect case in point. They weren't even advertised here in Hawaii. The realtors that sold those properties were in the mainland and in Asia. So if you were local, and I know because one of our realtors bought one of the places in the Ritz-Carlton, they actually had to contact a Los Angeles realtor to purchase the unit. There was no realtors actually here in Hawaii that were originally handling the sales. And that was sort of the 1990s mentality. High rises were built for, outsiders to invest in Hawaii. The early developments of Ward Village specifically were sort of originally, despite the spin they put on it, were actually intended for that same population. What shocked them, I think, was the fact that given the increasingly horrible traffic, especially on Kalani Island from Hawaii Kai, et cetera, and the increasing sort of centralization of services downtown, and the fact that the second city, Kapolei, et cetera, had totally just was a wash, was a disaster in terms of moving occupation out there, because people realized they were now having to drive from Kapolei to still work in town. Their offices were still here if they were state and county. So the movement of state and county services to Kapolei never happened. And so in some cases, they actually moved back here, historic sites, for example. So what you had was there was an enormous demand building for access that didn't require 2 to 3 hour commutes to get into work every day, not to mention $400 to $700 a month to find a spot to park your car, just to keep your job and, for the state Department of Transportation, we'll say. And so what happened is when these high rises started up in Kaka'ako, is much to their surprise, a large proportion of the buyers were local residents, either from Kaimoki or Palolo, who just wanted to sort of downsize out of a house, but a lot of them from what were basically outlying communities. Makakilo and Mililani, for example, were big, according to the folks who know at Hughes. They were shocked at the number of folks from Makakilo and Mililani, especially Mililani, that wanted to move into to Kaka'ako. They started a special advertising campaign out in Aina, Kuli'o and Hawaii Kai, because they started to realize demographically a huge proportion of folks wanted in. Buying a 2-bedroom condo in Kaka'ako meant that you could maybe get rid of one car. You didn't have a 4-hour-a-day commute in the stressful traffic. You actually, could walk to work maybe, or maybe bicycle to work. And so they actually started to buy into this argument of a village, I think much to the shock originally of Hughes and Kamehameha schools. So what happened is, because they now had this new local market, is the building started to accelerate. And other folks jumped on the bandwagon, still tapping the sort of mainland Asian market. That would be Park Place, the ones around Ala Moana Center, for example, One Ala Moana. So there were sort of two parallel trends going here. Now, what's happened in the last 10 years is, I'm not sure that the local market is sort of not dried up, but it's shrunk. All the initial demand sort of taken care of. And the folks that are now trying to decide if they're going to move into Kaka'ako are looking at it, and I'm not sure it's exactly what they thought it was going to be. More importantly, as the newer high rises have gone in, the newer Ward Village complexes, more and more what you're seeing is the pricing has gone up. So they're not only less affordable, but the mix of the population and the structures is much more reflective of sort of the 1990s model, where a large, increasing proportion of the folks living in the high rise are actually mainland investors and or Asian investors. In the building that I'm in, I'm at 600 Queen. I rent a unit here, but I noticed that a large proportion of the folks, especially on the lower floors, are apparently Airbnb. So a lot of folks I'm assuming that the owners, since the ones on my floor are pretty much local, but I know on the floors below me, a lot of them are Asian, largely Korean and Japanese. And then a fair number are mainland American, and you can tell simply because when they show up, they've got suitcases with them and they leave in a week or two. So the temporary part-time resident phenomena is starting to sort of regrow, if it would, in the high rises. And I think as the new high rises are going in, that's becoming more and more the proposition. So the older, say 2000 to 2010 high rises in Kaka'ako were a larger proportion, about 60% local, 40% others. I think the ones you're seeing now are more 60 to 70% others and maybe only 20 to 30% local. And there's a bunch of other dynamic factors that you can go into if you want to in your analysis, but that's, at least that's what I see here. Having said that, what that means is if you're going to try to figure out what you're going to do with this property, it's going to have to be a niche. You're going to have to do something unique. I'm not sure what would work. Obviously, there's a bunch of very bright people who are trying to do this because there's a tons of retail property available. Ala Moana Center alone is got huge amounts of empty space they can't figure out what to do with. So, finding a niche is really key. Your particular situation, unlike AMC or some other places, you got no parking. So whatever you have here has to be within walking distance. Especially given how lazy people are, I'd say walking distance is pretty much 2 or 3 blocks. Now, having said that, in the way that Kaka'ako is going to be in a couple of years, that's going to include probably 15 to 30 high rises within a reasonable walking space, which is probably, I don't know, 10, 15,000 people, which is fantastic. Ala Moana Center only has 4,000 parking spots. So if you can find something that taps a part of one of those high-rise populations, that's what you want to try to figure out. That's going to be your argument to the client. If you give it to a not-for-profit, now you have to remember, not-for-profit isn't the same as what used to be thought of as a nonprofit, like say Greenpeace or Sierra Club or something like that. Not-for-profit just means it's some sort of an organization that at the end of the day doesn't have shareholders and doesn't have to show a profit. It just has to break even. So that's what you're trying to do. I can only think of 2 options. One I don't think is very viable, and that would be sort of like a modern version of a souk, which is actually what I would argue is sort of what happened when Sports Authority, if you remember way back in the day when Sports Authority was closed. Hughes, when they took over the property, now it's a high rise, but when they took over the property, they gutted it and then basically turned it into sort of a open market. Not one of the ones we have for a couple of hours, but 6 or I think it was 7 days a week, open market till like 7 p.m. Very, very successful. And when they closed that down, they had promised that they were going to replace it with something else. Well, they sort of conveniently forgot about that. I would argue that would be one possibility for this. But what you'd want to actually do then is make sure that however you staged it, that whatever your merchant base was, that the merchants would have something that would be collectively not the same as each other, would be similar to each other. So you'd get the same audience interest. I leave that up to you to figure out what that would be. The interesting thing I remember about the Sports Authority was very striking is that the number of tourists was actually quite small. I'd say a good 60 to 70% of the population or traffic that got in that, setup was almost entirely local. And I'm not sure who did that for them. You might be able to go back and find out, but I would actually go back and take a look at that. It's not the same groups that you see are running the various sort of street fair things they do in Kaka'ako, which are just a version of the Saturday fair thing they do for Saturday mornings. Has to be something different than that because it has to be something that's persistent. This is only going to work if you have people coming down here, one, two, three times a week. And a lot of people in a rotating way, so there's constantly people in there, there's constant people buying or doing stuff. Maybe set it up as entertainment. I don't know, something, 3D entertainment venue. I don't know. Have to think of something. I'll leave you with a final thought on all this. The last boat I had tried to get rid of a while ago. I had a moored at La Mariana, which is in Kehi Lagoon. Very, very strange place. It's a moorage. It's an anchorage, but it's also a restaurant, which was set up by this French Tahitian lady. I can't remember her name. And she was really into what's called tiki culture. And so when she modeled the place, she ended up with all sorts of weird stuff, 1960s, 1970s, tiki kitchen stuff like this. I expect a lot of it was probably from the old stuff down at Waikiki. And that was the thing. That's still the theme of the place. Very strange location, really, very unique, very, very different. What's interesting is when I used to go down into the boat there, is it was always really busy. But the interesting thing is the population that was in the restaurant was almost entirely folks from Hickam Pearl Harbor. It was military, ex-military, military contractors. But they were down there, so it wasn't tourist. Well, maybe a few were tourists, but I mean, they were pretty much, as far as I could tell, almost all of them worked, down at Pearl in one way, shape, or form. And that had sort of become the clientele. They'd sort of adopted the La Mariana tiki culture kitsch. And and it was, they were a happy pair. The restaurant was making money. And those guys had a place to hang out they felt comfortable at. I don't know what you do. That's just a unique situation, but I'm not sure that she ever thought of that. But that's how it turned out. So maybe you need to find an audience that has a need, that has a place they want to be. And you can actually tap that because that's what you're going to have is something that gets constant use. Has to have people constantly using it, people going in, people going out. And you have to present that a convincing way to the client. There's this venue that does da 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 da. At this point in time, it ends up with X amount of people. Of that same demographic, we have X percentage of that in Kaka'ako estimated. We assume if we can put that, whatever it is here, that we can get this type of traffic and make this a popular place for X part of the population to hang out. It can't be for the folks in Kaka'ako. The client's not going to buy that. It has to be for a specific sub-audience. And that's what's going to be a large part of what you have to figure out. And this is where your interior design experience comes in, because if you think of everything this semester, basically what we've been looking at is how do physical venues, how do the built environment reflect, encourage, and reinforce cultural attitudes and values? So your outside is given. What you do on the inside is going to make this a success. And that's what you've got to convince the client of.